All right, this is a work session of the Portland City Council. This is Tuesday, October 19th, 2021. Commissioner Rubio, take it away. Good morning.
Good morning, Mayor. Good morning, colleagues. Thank you for your interest and presence this morning to learn more about historic resources in the City of Portland. The Historic Resources Code project launched in 2017, and now more than 4 years later and extensive work and engagement later, the project is now in this place to come before Council. And to give you an idea of how often the resources program is a critical part of our city work, just since I joined Council this January, we've already engaged in historic preservation issues at the Council level, such as parks master planning and demolition review. And just last week, BPS submitted nominations for 3 important African-American historic sites: the Gold West Hotel, Dean's Barbershop, and Mount Olivet Baptist Church, to be listed in the National Register of Historic Places. And these are all examples of why this project is critical and how we define and redefine historic resources. And today's intent is to prepare you for a November 3rd public hearing on proposed amendments to the zoning code. Staff from both BPS and BDS will provide presentation on the city's Historic Resources Program generally, and then Historic Resources Code project proposal specifically. So I'll now turn it over to BPS Director Andrea Durbin to start us off.
Thank you, Commissioner Rubio. Good morning. For the record, I'm Andrea Durbin, Director for Planning and Sustainability. We are excited to bring to City Council the next package of zoning code amendments. In recent years, City Council held similar processes for the Better Housing by Design, residential infill, shelter to housing continuum, Central City 2035, and the design overlay zone amendment projects. The Historic Resources Code builds off of those zoning projects by addressing the regulations for historic resources. We appreciate the chance to have a work session with you today to dive into the details of the proposed Historic Resources Code project, and also to make sure that you understand the Historic Resources Program that BPS manages for the city. Last fall, the Planning and Sustainability Commission held public hearing on the Historic Resource Code amendments. The PSC spent the winter and spring months conducting a rigorous review of the testimony and code proposals against the city's comprehensive plan goals and policies. The PSC voted unanimously to recommend City Council adoption of the code amendments at their May 4th meeting. You'll hear more about the PSC's recommendation at the November 3rd hearing from PSC Chair Eli Spivak. Today, you will hear from BPS staff Sandra Wood, our principal planner, Shannon Bono, senior code editor, and Brandon Spencer Hartle, our Historic Resources Code program manager, and BDS staff Hillary Adam, our senior planner. And now I'll turn it over to Sandra Wood to get things started. Thanks.
Good morning, commissioners, and thank you for being with us today. We'll go ahead and get started with the presentation. Brandon, can you pull that up, please? Thank you. So thank you, Andrea, and thank you, commissioners. As Andrea mentioned, I'm Sandra Wood. I'm the Code Development and Urban Design Manager at BPS. And last time we were here with the city at City Council with a package of amendments for the historic resources chapters of the zoning code was a really small project in 2013. So it's been a while that we've updated these zoning code provisions. And to make sure we have time to talk through the code changes and answer questions before the November 3rd hearing, we want to present today's work session in 2 parts. Next slide, please, Brandon. Thank you. The first part, we want to focus on the Historic Resources Program in total and the overall context for the code amendments that we're bringing to you with this package. Then the second part of the second hour, we want to focus on the Historic Resources Code project itself. We don't think we'll be here for a full 2 hours, but we'll see how many questions you have. Next slide, please. Thank you. So to get us started, let's talk a little bit about the program itself. The city has had a historic resources program since 1968. That's when the first historic landmarks and districts were designated. Along with most large cities in the US, Portland is recognized by the federal government through the National Park Service as a certified local government. That status makes Portland eligible for certain grants and ensures a line of communication between us and our partners in Salem and in Washington, D.C. BPS, along with the support of BDS, works with other bureaus also to ensure Portland is compliant with the state and federal historic preservation laws. For example, in the last few months, we provided the Parks Bureau with extensive input in the South Park Blocks master planning process, which you unanimously supported in July. We assisted the Portland Housing Bureau recently in gaining required state approval for the rehabilitation of the Joyce Hotel into affordable housing. And we've been in regular contact with various players to ensure that the regulations are met for statues that are removed, regardless of whether or not they will be returned to their original spot. Next slide, please. Thank you. Much of our historic program work is ensuring that the information on the history, incentives, regulations, and specific programs are available to the whole community. Much of that information that we keep is contained in a web-based database and map that's publicly accessible and updated on an ongoing basis. In addition to maintaining data, BPS is responsible for processing nominations for new landmarks and districts, which we'll talk about later. We also assist legislators and state agencies on historic preservation matters. And finally, we take on special projects whenever budget and time allows. Next. So in recent years, we've been excited about prioritizing securing outside funding to support landmark designation for underrepresented histories. Primarily, this work has been used to directly support paid and volunteer historians in documenting the city's rich African-American history. Over the past 6 months, we sponsored a nomination of 3 additional sites to the National Register: the Golden West, Dean's Barbershop, and Mount Olivet Church. These 3 buildings were identified by the Oregon Black Pioneers and the PALF's People Plan as top priorities for preservation. And as a preview, BPS has been awarded a National Park Service grant to initiate a project to document and designate LGBTQ historic resources citywide. We're very excited about this upcoming work. In addition to this work, the program is responsible for ensuring that the city's regulatory framework for historic preservation is routinely refined. And that is what we're spending most of today's discussions about, and that is what your hearing and further deliberations will be about. But before you get too excited about the program and all the ideas you have for historic preservation, I want to remind you that BPS's Historic Resources Program operates with only 1 full-time FTE. So basically, when I say the program, I'm talking about Brandon. Brandon is doing all this work. And while there's a lot of work to be done to recognize and protect underrepresented history, our capacity is limited. So I want to turn it over now to Hillary Adam, because BDS is our partner in this historic preservation work, and she'll describe how the Bureau of Development Services role in historic preservation in this work. Thank you.
Thank you. Hello, Mayor, City Commissioners. I'm Hillary Adams, Senior Planner at the Bureau of Development Services, BDS versus BPS. I'm the liaison to the Historic Landmarks Commission, and I've worked very closely with Brandon and Shannon Bono over the past few years drafting this code. In short, BPS writes the zoning code and BDS implements the code. We have a team of 10 in the design and historic resource review team, 9 planners and 1 supervisor. And we perform the design reviews and the historic resource reviews. So we review changes to existing buildings, and we review development in design districts and historic districts. And we are a fee-based bureau, whereas BPS is funded by general fund. BDS is funded by the applicants who come in and actually want to make changes or develop their properties. So the Historic Landmarks Commission is a 7-member volunteer body. They come from different backgrounds, all have a positive interest in historic preservation, but they include architects, historians, architectural historians, and a couple public at-large members to serve as the voice of the public on that commission. They meet twice a month. Typically, they review some of these larger land use cases for alterations to historic buildings and new buildings in historic districts, the bigger ones. They also serve as an appeal body for staff decisions. And you probably remember when they came to visit you for their State of the City earlier this year, I believe it was in March, and they presented their annual report. So you do get a chance to meet with them once a year where they highlight some of their past projects that they've reviewed and some of the major topics that they're struggling with. So I think that's all I want to say about BDS. I'm here if you have questions about implementation of the code and how that process generally plays out.
Thanks, Hillary. Good morning, Mayor, Commissioners. Brandon Spencer Hartle, Bureau of Planning and Sustainability Historic Resource Program Manager. And my pronouns are he, him for this morning's conversation. I'm going to lead you through the next little bit, which is sort of the big picture, Historic Preservation 101, down to the specifics of the zoning code before we get into our conversation in part 2 about what specifically is council hearing on November 3rd and how does it all fit together. We do have time for Q&A in 20 or so minutes after I get through the presentation, but some of this stuff is really brain twisting gymnastics. So if it gets confusing, do jump in, stop me, we can talk through it. But I hope we can lead us to a place where we've got the 101 down, talk through questions, then move into what are we proposing with the code. Okay, big picture. What are historic resources? Historic resources are the universe of places that are important to somebody, community, a group of people. It's everything old, everything that's ever existed is a historic resource to somebody. But more specifically here in the city of Portland, in cities around Oregon and nationally, we have a city historic resource inventory. And that inventory is like the bucket of places that have been documented for historic significance, that have been evaluated for importance, that have maybe architectural characteristics that were cataloged at some point in the past. And so that inventory is a big basket of places that are documented, that have gone through some level of peer review or consideration. Of those resources, some of them are significant, some maybe not so much. So on the inventory, there is a city determination of significant resource that are places that are important or are important to a community or the community at large. An even narrower list of those significant resources have been designated by the city as landmarks and districts. These primarily are historic landmarks, conservation landmarks, historic districts, and conservation districts. I'll talk in a few minutes about what the regulatory and practical differences are between those, but just start to think landmarks and districts are important places that have gone through a exercise to be designated for their significance and their importance to the community. So the city plays a role in the designation of landmarks and districts. So too does the National Park Service's National Register of Historic Places. Nationally, the federal government recognizes landmarks and districts that are important in some aspect of American history on this National Register of Historic Places. So city, National Register, both in the business of recognizing, honoring, evaluating the significance of places. But the way our current regulations operate are a little confusing and a little nuanced, in that whenever a individual property, let's say the Baghdad Theater, or a district, let's say a place like New Chinatown, Japantown, is added to that National Register of Historic Places, our current zoning code automatically applies city historic landmark or district status upon that federal listing. We're going to talk more about the specifics of that in a few minutes, but just know this universe of historic resources narrows to landmarks and districts for the purpose of regulations that I'll talk about in a few minutes. So on this list of landmarks and districts, those places that have gone through either a city or a national designation process, they can be buildings, most often they are. They can be districts, so collections of buildings or collections of resources. Willamette National Cemetery is an example of a district that's not buildings. And Rocky Butte Scenic Drive is an example of a district that is not buildings. But generally landmarks are buildings. Occasionally they're signs, sometimes they're landscape features, sometimes they're structures like the Burnside Bridge. In Portland, the vast majority of landmarks and the parts of districts are buildings, but there are some exceptions to that. And both for local landmark or district status or national landmark or district status, a property must have historic significance, must be important, it must have a reflection of a theme of history that's significant, and something called integrity. We're not going to talk a lot about that today, but basically integrity means, does it look like it did when something historic happened? Is it still the place that it was? And that can be architectural, that can be cultural. Integrity sort of means, is there that physical experience of continuity over time? Not surprisingly, and we'll show a map in a minute, in Portland, significance has generally been a white dominant story. It's a story of architecture, it's a story of power brokers, it's a story of, to no discredit for all of your hard work, people who filled your shoes a century or more ago. And it's only been in recent years that the city and organizations have been pushing significance of underrepresented histories, of social histories, cultural histories. We'll talk about that a little bit today, but we have seen and heard how much of the city's history hadn't in the past been considered significant, increasingly being considered as part of our significant story. Importantly, though, when we talk about landmarks and districts, while it is a recognition, it's maybe a celebration or a reflection on a place that's important, its designation is about land use, and it's about land use regulation. When the city designates a landmark or district, and I see Mayor Wheeler's hand is up, so I'll stop in just one second. When the city considers a designation of a landmark or district, we do so within our land use context. We're weighing goals and policy, we're weighing public benefits and burdens. The National Register doesn't do that. They're looking at significance and integrity. They're not looking at benefits, burdens, land use consequences, regulatory effects. And so there is a departure in what that federal listing and what that city listing considers. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. The last thing I'll say before Mayor Wheeler, I want to get to your question, is that there is a degree of owner consent required both at the local and the federal level to designate a landmark or a district. So if you, for example, if I were to propose designation of my supervisor Sandra's property to the National Register, Sandra would need to consent to that. And if we were at the city level to propose creating a new historic district, a majority of owners would need to consent. So sorry, Mayor, I know you have your hand up.
No, I appreciate it. I didn't want to interrupt your flow. So this is what I've always been hung up on. So I'm really glad you have this slide here. This is actually super helpful. So thank you. I'm still fuzzy on both the terms significance and integrity. Could you do just a slightly deeper dive? Significant in what way and to whom? Mm-hmm. And same around integrity.
It's a great question, Mayor Wheeler. I went through the University of Oregon's Historic Preservation Program for my training, and there are whole classes on both significance and integrity. So I'll try to give you the 101.
Yeah, just even the idiot's guide is acceptable in my case.
Significance is generally comparing a property's stories to others and determining that that property or that district really tells something important in the community's history that other properties don't. So an example might be, we've long had, and I've had the benefit of learning a lot about this, we've long had an African-American population in Portland. Not every individual person has left a significant contribution, but certainly the Norville Unthankful, Beatrice Morrow Kennedy have made a significant contribution to the city, and their stories are important. Or similarly, we have a lot of bungalows, housing type in Portland. Not all bungalows are important, but maybe one that's designed by an architect, or the first bungalow in a neighborhood, or a bungalow that is the most sort of architecturally recognized bungalow might rise that level of significance. We do have a list in the code of what determines significance, and generally it's on balance in comparison to other properties. Does it tell an important story that only it can tell? Integrity, on the other hand, is about workmanship, it's about the design, and it's about the associative features. So an example might be when you walk into City Hall. City Hall is a building that looks and feels much like it did when it was built in 1895. It's still got original stone and the windows and the elevators, and you walk in and you really get the sense of 1895. If, for example, City Hall were heavily altered with, let's say, I don't know, new siding, and infilled the light wells, and the council chambers were turned into office spaces, and the exterior of the building had a big addition on the top, and you looked at it and thought, I don't know when that building was built and I can't get a sense of its history. That might be a place that has lost integrity.
And
But-
so so the documentation would be, from your perspective, you basically need to cite it, right? You need to be able to say, well, this building was built in 1895. It has not been significantly altered. Although everybody here knows my pet peeve is you cannot open the windows, which I'm sure they could in 1895. And what about renovation? So if this City Hall underwent a major renovation in the 1990s, but it's my understanding that it was done in a way to not jeopardize that historic integrity. Is that
Right.
something that you have to document as well if a building's been renovated?
And we'll get into that a little more about the rules and the regulations and how that
I'll
happens.
wait
But
for that. Good, thank you.
generally that significance integrity, it's a snapshot in time. It's when a nomination is put together. And one hurdle we've been working with, and these code amendments seek to resolve it, is that oftentimes our underrepresented stories are in places that have had to change and be modified. They weren't architecturally necessarily our most significant buildings or our most recognizable landmarks. And so in these code amendments and in our work recently, working with Oregon Black Pioneers and others, we've been looking to have a little more flexibility on this integrity discussion to recognize that oftentimes there were important stories of people who lived in buildings that didn't have access to capital to do perfect restoration or to bring a building back exactly how it was. And so there is some flexibility there based upon what story is it telling. And I'll show an example in a few minutes of that. I'm going to keep us.
I appreciate it.
Yeah, you got it, Mayor. We'll talk more about the rules in a minute here. So what are landmarks and districts? Earlier, Sandra noted that Portland saw its first landmarks and districts designated over 50 years ago. It's been something that's happened for a long time. Some of those efforts have been city supported. Some of those efforts have been community driven, but certainly the efforts haven't led to a geographic or thematic equity in where landmarks and districts are created. And we can talk about specifics and look at the map more if council wants to, but looking at this map, what we know, the dots are the landmarks and the shapes are the different districts. And what we know evidently from the map without researching individual properties is that there are large sections of the community whose stories are not told in our listings of landmarks and districts. We do have, most of our landmarks are in the downtown area or in the inner ring neighborhoods. Most of our districts are also downtown and close in. And so we do we've overrepresented certain stories and others have been lost to time or not given the time and attention. And it's largely a product of the reliance on the National Register listing to convey this historic landmark and district status. Because the documentation to describe significance and integrity, to put together the package is a significant amount of work. And that work is even harder when the significant story is outside of the dominant narrative. And so these are, let's say, factors and thoughts that have gone into how can we amend the code, create a code that allows for and encourages a broader distribution of landmarks and districts citywide going into the future. We have 735 landmarks. It sounds like a lot, and it is a lot, but many of them are singular small buildings, like the Signal gas station in St. John's, or like the Paul Bunyan statue, or the Union Pacific smokestack tower near the Fremont Bridge. Many of these landmarks are small individual properties or buildings. At districts citywide, and I'm going to show an example of one district in a minute. Districts citywide contain anywhere from a small handful of properties, like Northwest 13th Avenue District in the Pearl, that warehouse loading dock zone. That's a small historic district. The downtown part of Kenton on Denver is a small historic district. Others, like Ladd's Addition and Irvington, are larger, and I'll show an example of that in a minute. I do want to mention as backdrop here, and since we have the former state treasurer on our group here, I would be remiss not to talk about tax incentives and financial benefits. Across the country, states and the federal government offer varying degrees of financial benefits for designated landmarks and districts to support their ongoing preservation. These are not things we have control over today in our zoning code, but they do set a backdrop of why we've seen interest in landmark and district designation, where we've seen them, how it dovetails with other initiatives for seismic upgrade or energy improvements. Since 1986, the federal government has offered a rehabilitation tax credit for the major rehabilitation of certain commercial buildings that are listed in the National Register. The state provides a property tax benefit for certain historic properties, and many local foundations offer grants and other incentives. These aren't things we have control over, but some historic landmarks are designated because property owners or tenants wanted to access these incentive dollars. Where we start to get to the meat of what we're going to talk about in our second part today is around state and federal regulations. So historic preservation, everything I've talked about up until now, documenting a property on the National Register, maybe accessing an incentive, all of that is on the recognizing, celebrating, documenting, maybe helping to fund improvements. But nationally, we have a National Historic Preservation Act that requires cities to consider effects on historic resources. So there's federal rules, but more specifically to our conversation today and on November 3rd, Oregon statewide land use goal 5 requires cities to protect landmarks and districts and to use the zoning code to do that. Specifically, land use goal 5 requires cities to at least provide demolition review as a protection to properties listed in the National Register. And our comprehensive plan, which went into effect in 2018, includes policies that specifically address the protection and reuse of historic resources. So unlike other decisions that might come before council, we have an interesting box that historic resource protection exists within, both at the federal and the state level. What that looks like locally and has looked like, and these proposals keep this general set of regulations. What it has looked like locally is that we today in our zoning code protect historic landmarks and historic districts that are listed in the National Register at our highest level of preservation regulations. City designated historic landmarks and historic districts get an intermediary, or let's say silver level of protection. And then city designated conservation landmarks and conservation districts, most of which are located in north and northeast, but not all of them, are afforded the least amount of protection. So since this current scheme was put into place, we've ceded the decision about protection largely to federal listing in the National Register, which doesn't consider land use consequences or, importantly, engage our Planning and Sustainability Commission, the broad community, or you on council. We protect historic resources in 4 pretty important ways. I'm not going to dig too much into it, but we have demolition review, which is something that you recently got a experience with in New Chinatown, Japantown. It's a land use process. It can result in approval or denial. We have demolition delay, which is just an administrative 120-day delay process. Historic resource review, which is what my colleague Hillary was talking about earlier, where alterations, additions, and new construction are required to go through a form of design review for compatibility. And then in some areas, we have an alternative to that review, which is clear and objective design standards. That's like a checklist of materials or design details to avoid that review process if you meet certain compatible design feature checklist. It's important to note that for historic landmarks and districts, the uses that are allowed in the base zones, so what is allowed on a property by the zoning, is allowed in a landmark or district. And so we'll use the example of the residential infill project. In our single dwelling zones, if a fourplex is allowed in the zone and the property contains a landmark, that landmark can be converted to 4 units of housing or ancillary buildings built on the site with additional housing. And unlike other cities, we have taken the approach that if a use is allowed in the zone, it's allowed in the landmark. And so one of the themes in today's amendments we're going to talk about is, since we're protecting these places, can we go further to allow for their adaptive reuse? Can we allow more uses since we have this sort of regulatory regime? But this scheme of applying protections to historic resources is something we have done since 1968. We regularly refine what those protections look like. One of the big moves today is to reconsider what relative role protecting National Register listings have compared to those city designations. And so we're going to talk more about that in a minute. But just for council to note, these 4 regulations: demolition review, demolition delay, historic resource review, aka design review, or an optional set of standards, are sort of the way we protect resources. We don't regulate the interior of buildings. We don't limit alterations inside. Instead of the mayor's question about City Hall, which is a historic landmark, interior changes to City Hall would not be subject to any land use reviews, only what's visible to the public.
Hey, Brandon,
Yeah.
I'm just going to do a little quick time check. It's 10 o'clock, so you know.
Perfect. I think we're right on. I got just 3 more slides here, and then we will open up to this discussion for a little bit before our next part. I want to talk a little bit about districts. Because individual landmarks, for better and worse, require owner consent for designation, much of the controversy in historic preservation doesn't swirl around landmarks. But because districts can be designated with just a majority of owner consent, specifically federal National Register districts, what I would anticipate on November 3rd, you will hear, as we've heard for several years, is significant interest and concern around districts. This is a map of our city's historic and conservation districts. The properties in yellow or gold are historic districts. Some of those are historic districts because of their listing in the National Register. Some are city designated. In silver are our small conservation districts that are in North and Northeast Portland. Those primarily came out of work that Bureau of Planning and Sustainability and Kim Moreland assembled in 1993 as a parallel to the Albina Community Plan to ensure that there were areas of cultural and architectural history that were protected, and envisioning future change. And then a couple of districts I'm not going to talk about in great detail that have recently been listed in the National Register of Historic Places. Primarily, this is Laurelhurst, Peacock Lane, and Eastmoreland, which is in the process of National Register listing. There hasn't been a decision yet. But citywide, these are where our districts are located. Again, you can see other places like Rocky Butte Scenic Drive or Willamette National Cemetery. Most of them are downtown or close in. But we wanted to bring council's attention back to work that the Planning Bureau has done with community in recent years around the racist history of the racist context of planning. We know citywide that land use decisions and private real estate decisions have led to the exclusion of certain communities from our neighborhoods going back in time. And since we're talking about historic districts and historic preservation today, we wanted to take the moment to just orient council to where our districts are and what we know about them. This map shows the, I believe it's the 1937 Homeowners Loan Corporation map, which is often referred to as the redlining map. Areas on the map, the colors, and I apologize for anyone who's visually impaired in our conversation today, the colors correspond with how neighborhoods and areas were rated for the purposes of mortgage lending. The green and blue areas were rated best and desirable. Oftentimes those are areas where people of color and other minority groups were not eligible for a mortgage or able to hold property. And then areas in yellow and primarily pink red were declining or hazardous. And those are areas that generally became redlined and were the only places in the city when people of color who were able to secure a mortgage were able to buy. What we know from our districts is that we have districts that are located in all of those areas, but historically were redlined. But some of our districts do tell, let's say, a story that is not about inclusion or doesn't necessarily represent a story about the broad base of Portlanders who live there. Others do. About 50% of the land in our historic districts are zoned single dwelling. The other 50% multi-dwelling, commercial, mixed use. And so there may be some takeaways, but I think our takeaway is that we want to present this as information, and that there's not a one size fits all type of district in Portland. We have districts that represent a spectrum of histories, architectural, cultural, and histories of harm and achievement. So we think we just wanted to kind of place this in the context of where are those districts at council prepared for the testimony that comes. I'm going to quickly share 2 examples, and we're going to open to questions. I just want to give you a sense of what does a landmark look like what's out there. So this is a historic landmark. It's the Otto and Verdell Rutherford House. It was designated on the National Register as a landmark, automatically became a historic landmark, not for architecture, but for the story of Otto and Verdell Rutherford and their support of the NAACP, and specifically holding in this building the NAACP credit union during the 1950s. It's an example to Mayor Wheeler. It's got a high level of significance because Otto and Verdell Rutherford and the NAACP, its integrity has been changed, that siding has been changed on the house, it's a newer chimney, the Rutherfords themselves replaced the porch. But because of the economic circumstances in which the Rutherfords lived, those design changes are part of the story. They're part of its significance. They don't detract from it. I should say it's one of 5, and soon to be 8 landmarks designated under that African American Historic Sites project that BPS has partnered with the community on in recent years. And it's subject to both demolition review and that historic research review.
Hey, Brandon, could I interrupt and just ask a question on that, because it raised one. So to be clear then, so as you said, you have to have the documentation. Is it the Landmarks Commission then that would evaluate those changes and determine whether or not they were in the context of, as you say, that the neighborhood or the situation or the finances of the time? So it's the members of the Landmarks Commission at that time that determine whether or not it qualifies?
That all gets packaged in a nomination, a big document.
Okay.
It talks about the significance and the integrity, and it's
Okay.
their lengthy. These are fun
to
reads. And that document, if it's a city designation, goes to the Landmarks Commission for a decision to designate of a landmark.
Yeah.
If it's a National Register listing, it goes to the National Park Service. And our
okay.
Landmarks Commission is given the ability to comment, to provide guidance.
On the federal side, you're saying the local can comment on the federal.
Comment on the federal. And occasionally we ask council to jump in to provide support for something, extra encouragement, or in cases where there's discomfort to help express concern about it.
But ultimately, the decision is the commission's, correct? At either the federal or at the local level?
Ultimately, the federal level is up to the feds. So even if the Landmarks Commission says we don't think this should be a landmark, the nomination still proceeds to the feds. We are only an advisory body, which is part of the strangeness of the arrangement.
And at the local level?
The Landmarks Commission is the decision maker for landmark designation. These code amendments, we'll talk about in a minute, would have city council be the decision maker to create or remove historic districts, so collections.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you. I appreciate that.
One district that you are certainly to hear about on November 3rd is the Irvington Historic District. I wanted to flag this day as an example of a district, but also the one that we've heard most consistently throughout the multi-year process of an area of concern, optimism. It's the district that comes up the most often in our discussions, and we assume it will on November 3rd. So Irvington, the significance for Irvington is squarely in the architecture and development history. It was nominated to the National Register by the Irvington Community Association in 2010. Our Landmarks Commission held an advisory review, provided comments on the nomination. But ultimately, because it's a federal designation, that nomination went to the National Park Service, who determined that Irvington is significant, it has integrity, and it ought to be listed in the National Register because of that. Our zoning code automatically conveyed historic district status to Irvington when it became listed on the National Register. And so since 2011, Irvington has been a city historic district by virtue of that automatic local designation. In the district, and this is harkening back to your recent discussions around the Blanchet House, there are contributing or what's historic properties, things that were built during the pre-1940 period that have that integrity, that tell that Irvington story. Those are the blue squares on the map. And then what's called non-contributing buildings. They're the new building, a vacant lot, a site that doesn't have anything historic. Those contributing buildings are all subject to demolition review, and everything within the district is subject to historic resource review, which is that form of design review. So Irvington, I mentioned because it's the largest historic district by a lot in the city. It's also one of our most recent historic districts. And it, I think, exemplifies the current relationship to the National Register, and that National Register automatically brings with it that historic district slate of protections in our local code. I know I covered a lot. That's where I'd like to stop for this first part one. And we've got 10, 15 minutes if we need it to just talk through questions about how does it work? How's the system set up today? And then we're going to talk about what's proposed to change and the nuts and bolts.
If I may jump in there.
Yeah, it's a work session. So Brandon, if you want to either call on people or just have people jump in.
I trust you to jump in.
Brandon, as you can tell, we're just fascinated by this presentation. I'm fascinated by this Irvington map because I used to own a house in Irvington and used to watch the historic home tours come through, and once a year. They didn't come to my house, they went to houses around me. So when you talk about non-contributing for this designation, I suspect the house that I used to own would be one of the non-contributors because it's not a historic, the house itself wasn't a historically designated house. But it sounds like now, if I still own that house, if I wanted to change something, it would cost me a lot of money and a lot of time in order to renovate a house that I owned in a area that's now been designated a historic by the federal government. Am I accurate in that?
That may be true, and I may call on my colleague Hillary to talk about that cost. But in a district, all those exterior alterations and new construction would trigger that historic resource review. The review timeline, process, and fee is scaled to the magnitude of change. And so if you were proposing minor change to the building, that would be a pretty quick and easy process. If you were reconstructing in its entirety, bigger. An important thing to note, though, again, is interior changes not subject to review. And there's a lengthy list of items that are exempt. Painting a previously painted surface, re-roofing, making alterations to basement windows. Part of these code amendments lengthen that list of items not subject to a review.
And let me ask one more question. I see Commissioner Mapps has his hand up as well. So if I am a property owner in this area, I got to vote on this historic designation. But if I'm a renter, I had no say in what was going to happen in the preservation process, right?
That's right, Commissioner. So both for the national listing and the local listing, it is owner consent that is tallied, not community consent or renter consent.
And is any of the changes you're going to make going to take into account community concerns, whether people own property or whether they just are renters like half of the people in Portland?
Yeah, good question. As a renter myself, I'm understanding your question pretty clearly. In the code amendments, we cannot change that National Register owner relationship, but we can reframe the discussion for local designation. And we'll talk a little bit about how a central theme of these amendments is to reduce automatic protection for National Register and to really build that local designation as the vehicle for protection, because with the local designation, that requires a council decision. We weigh benefits and burdens in the comp plan and allow for testimony from renters, the full interested public. And owner consent, Oregon law still says you've got to get 50% of the owners, but that's not the only community that's considered.
If Commissioner Hersey's done, Brandon, I have a couple of just clarification questions. Can you provide us with more details about the difference between a city designated historic district and a city designated conservation district? How are those two different?
Yeah, great question. City designated historic district is a place, let's say a district, that is subject to those tightest regulations, the demolition review and the historic resource review. The idea with city conservation districts is that they're important, maybe just as important, but they're maybe more appropriately protected at a more flexible level. And so the existing conservation districts we have today offer this clear and objective design alternative to historic resource review. So if Commissioner Hardesty's house were in a conservation district, Commissioner Hardesty could choose from a prescriptive list of siding materials or window types and avoid that review altogether by going to the clear and objective checklist. It's not necessarily the best way to protect at the highest level a historic place so that it never changes. But what it does do is it gives the community a set of options for more flexibility. Maybe if that historic area is in a part of town where owners aren't necessarily as capitalized, or what makes a resource significant might be more open and flexible for change. And so it really is about a degree of protection rather than a degree of importance.
Great, thank you. And the other clarification, and I think you might have been getting at this in your exchange with Commissioner Hardesty, does council have the authority to decouple? So we have districts and landmarks that are recognized by the federal government, and we kind of automatically kind of say the feds think these are important, and so are we. Do we have the option to not do that? Do we have the option to say the feds think this is important, but we don't think this is, we have no interest in protecting this particular space?
The answer is yes and no. These code amendments seek to get to the closest version of yes, as is legally feasible. Lowering the national, I'll show you a chart in a minute.
Okay.
Lower the national register to the minimum state required level of protection, just demolition review, and then require a local designation to add conservation status with those design standards, historic status with that full discretionary review as a result of a land use process that comes before the council. State law does say we need to apply that demolition review, so we can't fully decouple, but what we can do is we can rearrange the respective regulation that comes with national register listing. These code amendments, I should say, Commissioner, don't do that for any specific district. They don't turn Irvington from a historic district to a conservation district or elevate a conservation district to a historic district. But what they do is they provide the framework for that discussion in the future where we haven't been able to have it in the past.
Okay, thank you very much. And as long as I have you going, I'd like to provide you with the opportunity to provide some general comments or observations about what the difference. Actually, can we go back to the blue and yellow map? Okay, so here we're looking at historic districts versus non-historic districts, historic buildings versus non-historic buildings, and we have a mix. Irvington is everything in there is protected. What impacts does being protected have on a community, other than sort of preserving the aesthetics at a specific moment in time? Do we have any sense of, is that a displacement? Does that contribute to displacement? Does that inhibit development? I don't have intuition here. I think I know some of these blocks, and they're all over the place in terms of, I think, wealth and character. Do you have a sense of what difference these designations actually make in the real world?
Yeah, good question. It is rare for a contributing or historic property to seek demolition approval. So they're a lot less likely to be redeveloped. We have considered that with the zoning, the height limits and the development capacity that's applied, and how we consider historic landmarks and districts as places for growth and change. They're more places of stabilization and preservation. And on those non-contributing sites, whatever uses are allowed in the base zone are allowed there too. So you might see a fourplex built in Irvington, or you might see a new apartment building built on one of those non-contributing sites. As for the people who live there and the impact of historic district designation on the people, what we know is districts, much like with the history of racist zoning, we know districts are all over the map of what people live there and who live there. Irvington, Laurelhurst, and Eastmoreland, we know certainly have higher income earning households, less percent Black, Indigenous, and people of color who live there. But other historic and conservation districts like Kenton or New Chinatown, Japantown, or Northwest 13th Avenue District, they have a very different demographic profile. And so what we have is not necessarily a one-size-fits-all rule about the impact of districts. We do have many of our affordable housing developers who have specifically chosen to rehabilitate historic buildings to access some of those financial incentives and to build new buildings in historic districts because of proximity to services or the use of other financial incentives that come with historic district development. So we do see examples of affordable housing in historic buildings and in historic areas, leveraging that historic designation for the incentives.
And I'll ask one more question and then turn it over to my colleagues to let you guys move forward. Can you take us to the citywide map of historic districts? Yeah, I just like staff to, I think anyone looking at this will be struck by the fact that we have essentially no historic districts east of 92nd. And I for the record, and for people who are just kind of tuning into this topic for the first time, could you explain to us sort of where that comes from?
That's a great question, Commissioner. I think I'll answer it in two ways. One, for much of historic preservation's existence, both nationally and in Portland, that historic significance piece was really dominated by the city's dominant story of early development, architectural significance. And so in previous historic preservation efforts that were both conducted by the city and the community, those stories were largely underrepresented. A second one, and maybe it's a easy answer, is much of East Portland was annexed after the city did some of its early survey of historic resources and community outreach in the 1980s. And so East Portland was not the beneficiary of that city-sponsored work. And then the third one I'll mention, and it's one I think for discussions of future work, is much of the landmark and district designation efforts have been community-driven. And those communities who have the resources to put together an extensive nomination for the National Register have been able to do it. And those communities who don't have the resources, and a city that has to make tough financial decisions hasn't necessarily had the resources available to support those efforts, to put together documentation that oftentimes requires an historian and public outreach and oral interviews and those types of things.
Great, thank you very much. All of that's very helpful. Having spent some time in East Portland, especially in the Park Rose neighborhood, which has its own fascinating and unique history, I know that there are historic buildings there that help tell a Portland story. And it is, I think, certainly in some cases unfortunate that we haven't had a chance to recognize them, and I hope preserve them for future generations. And with that, I'll put my hand down and let my colleagues have the floor.
Yeah, I just put, excuse me, good morning, everyone. I just put my hand up. One, I have a process question. Have you, great presentation, Brandon. Are you finished with your presentation? All of you? Oh, okay. Why don't I put my hand back down and allow that to continue? Thanks.
So maybe I'll go ahead and keep moving us along, because we've talked about the program and the context, but we actually haven't talked about the project, which is what we're here for. So are we ready to go on to part two? So Brandon, okay, great. And Brandon and I will be a little disciplined of trying to move us through these. So part two is really about the project itself. And why are we here and why are we making these amendments now? So this slide shows the various reasons that we're proposing amendments to the zoning code. I don't want to read through all of them because I'm really aware of time, Brandon. We've got 35 minutes left. And I think you've touched on all of them. There was an admin rule change in 2017 that requires us to make changes, and the admin rule happened at the state level. The second reason is we were observing that there were recent efforts to list large residential areas in the national district. And as Brandon mentioned, that bypasses city decision-making. So we wanted to address that. We had also heard from community members that had identified exterior alterations that are currently subject to review. And some community members were saying this seems overkill, that this goes through review. We work closely with Bureau of Development Services on expanding our list of exemptions from review. And as you saw on the map earlier, we need to make changes to ensure that underrepresented stories are told. We talked about that. And finally, there is a lot of interest among Portlanders to allow for more flexibility to encourage and continue use and rehabilitation of historic resources, because the city is changing over time, and our needs are changing for all Portlanders. Next slide, please.
Sandra, I think we've been pretty good on time. I think we have an hour and 5 minutes. We won't need all of that.
We do? Oh, we started at 9:30. Thank you. Okay, I won't rush so much then. Let me talk to you about this slide, which is about our value propositions. Whew. Okay. When we launched this project, we actually set out to write the code that adhered to 5 value propositions. I still won't read all of these. Mayor Wheeler, you have your hand up. Do you want to say something?
I didn't want to interrupt you, but I love this sign so much that it got me onto one of my big questions. Are we saving these signs? When somebody goes in, I mean, obviously we don't own them, right? I mean, they're privately owned, but is there any effort to save them from redevelopment, from demolition?
Mary, that's a great question. And we are testimony for this project is available in the MAP app. And we just got a letter from PDX Neon with their suggestions on how we can better save neon signs. In the code amendments, we do try our hardest, since owner consent is required for designation, to create an easy path and a better path to protecting a sign, like this sign specifically, without requiring the protection of a full property, which has made some owners hesitant to consent to a designation, since it would today require the full property be protected rather than just the sign.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, some of my favorite landmarks in Oregon are just signs, and thoughtful people demolished their businesses but kept the signs up, that kind of thing. And they really are touch points. And I think, what was the group you just mentioned?
PDX Neon.
I think they presented, didn't they, to city council maybe a year and a half-ish ago, year ago maybe. And I mentioned at the time that Boston actually has a neon park. So they have a place where old signs go to die, if you will, where they can be publicly seen and appreciated. And I just, I'd hate for us to lose signs like that. I mean, that one there, it's just so tacky and fanciful that you can't but help smile when you look at it. So that was just my thought. Thank you.
No problem. We'll continue going. I think that's exactly like the visceral reaction we all have, right? And to the meaningful and tangible connections to our past. We certainly heard that throughout the comprehensive plan, where we engaged 20,000 Portlanders, and the historic resources policies were updated to reflect that that's still really important to Portlanders. And they believe that historic preservation can play an important role in the city's evolution. So connections to the past and the reuse of existing buildings can benefit both people and a sense of place and the planet. Allowing historic preservation to reflect a diversity of stories can also celebrate the past, and it also requires us to confront past harms that we've had in the past. And importantly, historic places can and should evolve to stay relevant to a changing Portland. Next slide, please. So as we've mentioned, this project was launched over 4 years ago. We started with a series of concept workshops and surveys. Then in 2019, we provided the opportunity for the broad community to read and provide comments on a discussion draft of possible code changes. We then incorporated that public feedback into a proposed draft that went to the Planning and Sustainability Commission last fall. They held 2 public hearings. And after considering the code changes and public testimony, they held 4 work sessions along in those work sessions, the chair of the Historic Landmarks Commission participated in all of those, Kristen Miner, and the PSC unanimously recommended a package of code amendments that's before you today. And that is what Brandon will go ahead and share with you. Mayor Wheeler, your hand is still up. I suspect that that's
Oh,
a
man.
hand, right?
I hate it when that happens. Boom.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, Brandon.
So now we're going to make the leap into what's actually being proposed for a change today. The Historic Resource Code project is a rethink of our zoning code regulations that pertain to historic resources. They are in alignment with the minimum state requirements for City of Portland. And they advance those comprehensive plan goals and policies that Sandra briefly alluded to. When testifiers come to council in a few weeks, when they submit their testimony online, they may likely tie their comments to one of 5 themes that we've organized these proposals around. So the 5 themes of code change address identification of historic resources, what resources are eligible for being added to that historic resource inventory or designated as landmarks or districts. How do we consider significance more broadly? How do we consider integrity more broadly? With an eye towards diversifying our list of landmarks and districts on that inventory of historic resources. So really expanding our thought process around what are the types of historic resources and what areas of history are they important in. And then designation of landmarks and districts. What's the process and the criteria to establish or remove that city historic or conservation landmark or district designation? I'll talk more in a minute. We can't affect the National Register listing process, but we can hone in on our local process for designation of landmark and district. And then designation, since it conveys protection, that the land use regulatory consequences of designation of protection, how can we refine both the demolition and the design regulations that apply in landmarks and districts? Also, importantly, preservation isn't just about regulating historic property, but how can we use the zoning code to encourage rehabilitation, community access, new and inclusive uses in historic resources through providing use-based incentives for historic property tenants and owners. And then last, that's why we have Hillary Adam here today, how can we improve the code so that it's usable by applicants, city staff, and the public? It's clear and it is appropriate for application of regulation. I'm going to talk about each theme. Some of what is on the screen, we're not going to talk about a lot unless council wants to jump in. But my goal here in the next slide is just to really get you to think about what it is that's proposed and highlight those areas that are likely to generate the most testimony or that are big moves in the code amendments. Since we are completely replacing the historic resource chapter of the code, there are many moving parts. Some of those are non-controversial. There are others that you'll receive testimony on from differences of perspective. In theme 1, identification, we're redefining what each type of historic resource is that's regulated by our zoning code. What are the different types of landmarks and districts? And what hierarchy, or how do we hierarchically organize them for the purpose of protection, which I'll talk about in a minute. The big moves here are twofold. One, the changes in the code for identification allow the city to work with community to document historic resources, to determine those resources to be significant without a designation. So because owner consent is required, some places aren't important or appropriate for protection. These code amendments allow city staff and the broad community to document historic resources, to catalog that information, and to not necessarily regulate them. But when regulations are to be applied, and I'll talk about what those regulations are in a minute, these code amendments elevate city, historic district, and historic landmark status for the highest level of protection and lower the protection of National Register landmarks and districts to the lowest level of protection, creating a floor that's established by state law that says, hey, we've got to apply demo review to National Register landmarks and districts, and relying on city decision-making where the full community can participate to apply protections above and beyond that. Let's say it's flipping the system we have today for the purpose of protection, but it all is articulated in the zoning code with the goal of allowing the National Register to function as a federal designation, apply those minimum state level laws, and then really rely on local designation to apply any design protections or tighter regulations on the property. Commissioner Matz.
Thank you. So can you, for spaces and buildings that have the national protections on the National Register, can you describe the protections that the feds impose there? Are they significant or are they symbolic?
Yeah.
So are we? I think probably because of your previous slide, I kind of thought of the National Registry as being like uber protected. And as we got to the local things, there were fewer protections. So one of my questions is, if there are a lot of protections for the National Registry that the feds are somehow going to protect, and we're elevating our local, well, anyway, I'll let you dig in if you see where I've got the space I'm exploring.
In 49 states, the National Register is an honorific designation. Oregon is the only state that applies protection. And we apply protection because of a statute and the administrative rules that back that statute. Before 2017, the administrative rules and our local code elevated that National Register listing to the highest level of protection, saying if a property or a district is listed in the National Register, automatically should become a city historic landmark and district and get protected at the highest level. With council support in 2017, City of Portland and a coalition of other local governments and organizations worked on a change in state administrative rule that gives cities the ability to protect National Register at a lower bar, just demolition review, and to do what all of our counterpart large cities do, which is really rely on that local process to apply more protections. And so this flips our current system for how we treat the National Register upside down, consistent with state law, and also consistent with what we've heard from the broad community, which is we need to consider benefits and burdens and larger community issues before we add more protection.
Okay, thank you. That's interesting.
The key move here in this identification is that we've created this sort of hierarchy of historic resource types. I'll talk about the protections in a minute, which is reshifting, or let's say reallocating which resources are the most protected and which ones are subject to less protection. To be designated as a landmark or district, again, the city can't add or remove things from that national list, but what we can do is ensure that our local designation processing criteria is sound, that it elevates underrepresented stories, that it is accommodating of integrity changes that are culturally specific or that are the product of our sort of racist lending and land use history. And that also that the right body makes decisions about designating landmarks and districts. So the code amendments establish a procedure so that the city can work with communities to add information to the inventory, to evaluate resources as being significant without necessitating their designation and protection as landmarks. This is one of those sort of not so controversial pieces of the puzzle, allows that documentation work to happen, it allows stories to get elevated. And then specific to designation, it revises the criteria and procedures for creating at the city level landmarks and districts. And importantly for districts, and I think you're going to get a lot of testimony on this, district designation or the removal of district designation at the local level would be a city council decision within that land use context and framework, weighing comprehensive plan goals and policies and benefits and burdens to decide whether or not a significant place, it may be important, is actually appropriate for that protection or not. And importantly, in the big picture thing here is these code amendments would give city council the authority to reconsider existing historic districts in the future. That if we have historic districts that maybe aren't appropriate for historic district protection, that option would be open to have those land use conversations about the right level of protection for a place that may be important, but maybe less important for protection. Commissioner Hardesty.
Thank you. Actually, it occurred to me, how often do you think, if in fact, let's say we make these changes into policy, the city council now spends what I think is an inordinate amount of time on land use disputes. what impact is this going to have on the city council if these decisions are now made at the council level? And have you thought what that process would look like?
Yeah, good question, Commissioner. The current code and what we've done for a long time excludes the council from these decisions of protection. And so what's proposed is that the council would be the decider, and the council would make a decision after a recommendation from the Planning and Sustainability Commission. And that recommendation may be as part of a bigger package of map amendments, or it might be a district-specific project that's amending the zoning or changing things specific to a district. But on the practical side, we do have 26 districts in the city. Most of those districts, I would be surprised if there was a public interest or community interest in removing their designation in the future. There may be just a handful where we've heard a lot of interest from the public of let's revisit that. And then for new districts, it's a pretty big lift. You've got to demonstrate that significance and integrity. We've got to get 50% owner consent, talk to communities, really make sure it fits within our growth and development framework. Well, I'm sure council in the future under these code amendments will be considering new districts. It is not something that I would expect council to be hearing even annually. It's something that these districts and landmarks really ought to be important and really ought to tell a significant enough community story that they're worthy of protection. And I think that that's the type of district and that's the type of landmark that the process would want to bring before council is something that really, really is important to the community. The alternative for decision making, and we've heard interest out there from, delegate decision making to the Landmarks Commission or delegate decision making to the Planning and Sustainability Commission. Because a district would affect a large number of properties, the staff really feel like delegating it to a commission is not the appropriate thing to do. Now, for individual landmark buildings, for a single property, that would generally not come to city council because the owner is consenting, and those will come up far more often. We want to get those criteria right. We want to make sure it's a good evaluation, but it would be rare that we would ask the council to make that decision.
Thank you. I would hate to think I was doing something really bad to future councils.
So designation conveys protection. The difference between a historic district and a conservation district is about protection, not so much about whether it's significant. These code amendments do several things around protection. I'll try my best to be succinct here. The code amendments ensure that all city and national register designated landmarks and contributing buildings and districts are subject to demolition review. And to do that and do that successfully, the code amendments amend the approval criteria and the procedures for demolition review to scale with that level of protection. For example, the code amendments would allow for more paths to get to yes for demolition of a National Register residential district than for an individual landmark like the Hittick Mansion or something. That we really wanted to use that hierarchy I showed, and I'll show it again, to apply the strongest demolition review to those things that are at the historic level, and then give more options for demolition approval, for example, development of affordable housing, mitigation, other items for those resources that are less protected. The thinking being that demolition review provides the full public with the opportunity to weigh in on a proposed demolition and requires, when appropriate, there to be some level of mitigation and protection. We know, and this is a pretty new council, so Mayor Wheeler may have been the only one on council. Council, according to our current code, requires council to review the demolition of garages in historic and conservation districts. The code amendments eliminate the practice of garages coming to city council for demolition review. So that's 1,700 fewer buildings citywide subject to demolition review. We know that garages can be replaced with ADUs or other uses that are more appropriate. And so the code amendments exempt garages and sheds from demolition review. And importantly, at the National Register and conservation level of protections, the Landmarks Commission would be the first to review body for demolition review, appealable to council out of acknowledgement of your workload, and that demolition review is maybe appropriate for council to consider demolition review for an individual landmark, but maybe you would be better served as the appellate body for other resource types. On the other side of protection, there's demolition protection and there's these design protections. The code amendments increase the list of items that are exempt from any design regulation for landmarks and for all types of districts. Those exemptions include solar panels on all roof slopes would be allowed without a review in places like Irvington or in the downtown core. Allowing solar panels on rooftops, staff believe are reversible changes to buildings. They don't, destroy historic integrity. And so this is a pretty drastic change to allow solar panels. I think we are ahead of the curve of all American cities other than DC on moving this direction of saying solar, we're going to allow by right. But other alterations and additions and new construction would no longer be subject to review, such as seismic upgrade to buildings, new detached accessory structures in historic and conservation districts, EV charging outlets, certain window replacements. There's a long list that's proposed for no longer requiring that review, with the intent of doing two things. One, streamlining the approval of good projects that we want to see happen, solar and housing projects. And two, to Commissioner Hardy's point, to reduce unnecessary reviews for minor alterations don't destroy a historic resource or seriously alter its character. And over the course of the process, I think we brought a lot of people along with us and thinking more globally about what things can be taken out of the review bucket. And importantly, any national register listing going forward that has no city landmark or district designation would have no design controls. It would just be demolition protection. Commissioner.
Sorry, I hate to break your flow, but I have a question. So I think there's an effort now for the park blocks to have a national designation. That's being done by private landowners. And what impact does that have on the city if in fact we designate? Does that mean everything in the park blocks would then have to go under intensive review for any kind of upgrades other than the exemptions that you've mentioned?
As Sandra mentioned, one of the roles we play is working with all bureaus on preservation issues. And so we've had the benefit of working closely with the Parks Bureau on the master plan for the park blocks. And today's zoning code, existing rules, National Register listing automatically brings demolition review and all those design protections. Under the proposed change, National Register District would only bring demolition review for resources identified as contributing. And in the final version of the South Park Blocks National Register nomination, there are just a handful of physical elements in the park blocks that were identified as contributing. Those would be subject to demolition review. Tree replacement, new statues, changes to circulation, the green loop, all those things would not be subject to any additional regulation as a consequence of that National Register District under these code amendments.
Thank you. That's helpful.
And if I could jump in here, I've had a question percolating for most of the morning. Do we have an historic designation for any natural spaces that are historically important? The parks are kind of an example of that, although that's also a design space. But I was just wondering if that's a category that exists.
It's a good question. So two things. One, we don't use the historic resource provisions of the zoning code to regulate living things. So generally, there's a heritage tree program in the tree code that deals with trees, but the zoning code is not really dealing with living trees. But we do have several parks that are designated as historic landmarks and districts, parts of Peninsula Park or Laurelhurst Park, Terwilliger Parkway, Mount Tabor. But we haven't generally used historic designation for open spaces or natural spaces. With our new broader approach to significance, I would look forward to conversations about places that have indigenous significance that may be a good candidate in the future.
Great, and that's one of the things I've been thinking about. I'm not sure how many spaces that we have that recognize Native communities, for example. But certainly there's a rich history here, but we might not have a building. All right, thank you. I see Commissioner Ryan has a question.
Yeah, thank you. Because Commissioner Mapps put that on the table, that's what's been on my mind the entire morning. And my question is, are you working with Tribal Government Affairs Office when it comes to natural landmarks throughout the city?
We haven't on any proposed specific landmarks or districts under these code amendments. What we have recently done is through a previous zoning code project that this council voted on, did expand the area of the city that's subject to archaeological review and protection for village sites, burials, and areas of indigenous importance in the Willamette South Reach area. And so we know there's a lot of work to be done. Sometimes there are spaces that may still be natural, but we know that there's work to be done citywide to ensure that indigenous history is protected, and some of that's going to be below ground resources. And so that conversation we've been having quite a bit with Laura John and our great staff at our Office of Government Relations.
Okay, good. All right, more on that, I'm sure. Thanks.
I'm going to keep us moving along just to give a summary of what those protections look like.
Before you move us along, Brandon, can I just share? I think there's an interesting connection here because our statewide land use system has multiple goals, 12 goals, I think. And one of them is goal 5 about historic resources and environmental resources too. So we also have an inventory of our natural environmental resources, and you'll be seeing the environmental zoning code project coming through next year. So it's similar in the sense that they're both goal 5. We use an overlay for both of these resources. The protection levels are different though, because obviously the goals of what we're trying to accomplish through historic preservation program are different than what we're trying to accomplish through the protection of natural resources. So in that way, they're kind of cousins. And we can get into that when we come back with our environmental zoning code project.
So to get to the core of this regulatory piece, the code amendments create a hierarchy of these historic resource types, moving the National Register designation to the bottom of the protection list, city designation higher up, applying demolition review to all types of resources with different criteria, different options for getting to yes, and then increasingly rigid design regulations at the conservation level and the historic level. Most of our historic resources today are that historic landmark and historic district level, at highest level of protection. And our code today and for the last 25 years hasn't allowed for resources to move up or down that list based upon their significance, integrity, or importantly, the appropriateness of protection. These code amendments would allow, let's say, a historic district that wasn't appropriate for protection at that highest level to be reduced in its level of protection to a conservation district or a National Register district. That would be the result of a proposal developed by Bureau of Planning and Sustainability with the vetting of the Planning and Sustainability Commission. But it's an important piece of the overall puzzle that gives us the ability to recognize resources as being significant and to protect them at an appropriate level, rather than to default everything to the maximum level of protection that's listed in the National Register. And so while it's a change in the way the system has worked, staff are confident this is national best practice, it's international best practice. Having 3 flavors of protection makes good sense, considering that the tenants, owner, or the building story itself might not be appropriate for the highest level of protection. And that it gives an individual owner options if they're thinking about designating their commercial building, or a congregation if they're thinking about designating their church. It gives them options at the time of designation to sign up for what they feel is the appropriate level of protection, given that there's an owner consent requirement. And given that the occupants of a building or place have different financial and lived experiences, and protection of one size fits all protection program doesn't always work with every community and every population. I'm going to move us along. I've got just a couple more slides here, and then we're just going to get into questions. We talk a lot about regulation in the zoning code. We talk a lot about regulation in terms of historic resources. That resources are protected, that we apply these controls for demolition and exterior alteration. But our code today has a few provisions that allow for use incentives for historic resources. Zoning code doesn't give cash incentives or have a monetary pot of money to support seismic upgrade or conversion to affordable housing. But what we can do, and the Land Use Board of Appeals and National Preservation Best Practice has moved us in a direction to recognize that adaptive reuse and use flexibility is equally important to regulation and ensuring that historic resources can evolve, can meet the needs of a changing community, and importantly, especially in our residential zones, have the potential to overcome some of their past history of exclusion. And so in addition to the regulations, the zoning code also provides flexibility for designated landmarks and districts by exempting parking requirements from individual landmarks and districts that were built before the automobile, that maybe don't have space for required parking if additional housing is added or alterations are made. So parking requirements would go away for landmarks and districts. Many landmarks and districts already are exempt from parking requirements, but ensuring that historic places can be restored and altered to be brought back to a time before reliance on the automobile. And also expanding use allowances, specifically in residentially zoned areas. Historic landmarks and buildings in historic and conservation districts could be internally converted to any number of housing units. So going well beyond the residential infill residential uses to allow multi-dwelling new structures, to allow second accessory dwelling units, to allow conversions to sixplexes or eightplexes. We were intentional to make sure those use incentives didn't conflict with or overshadow the affordable housing provisions of the residential infill project. And so if you were developing a new building or an addition in a historic district and needed that extra floor area, you still would be required to have the units be affordable. So we were mindful of not wanting to undermine that affordability requirement for a residential infill project, but really thinking about the potential for larger, older structures to adapt to new uses. And trying a new approach to allow for garages and basements and other maybe lesser used parts of buildings in residential areas to convert to offices, limited retail and commercial uses, really thinking about allowing for flexibility in these areas where we've applied land use regulation to encourage seismic upgrade, building reuse, and at the core, getting more members of the community the ability to access and engage with these historic places that are important enough to warrant protection. Therefore, they ought to be important enough to allow for that flexibility and to allow for the largest number of community members to engage with them. And then last, this is a minor little detail, removing some barriers to what we call transfer of development right, where owners of historic landmarks around the city can transfer their unused development potential to another site for new development. Not a huge change, but we think there's some regulatory red tape that we can eliminate in these code amendments. And the last theme, and I welcome Hillary to jump in if appropriate, working with the Bureau of Development Services closely on these code amendments, talking with our partner bureaus over the course of the amendments, really wanting to make sure that we can get the administration of the code right, that we can lower the level of review wherever appropriate, and ensure that we've streamlined while still protecting historic resources, the regulations that apply to them. And really think about relying on, if there are resources that aren't appropriate for our strongest protection, our greatest level of consideration, that those lower levels of protection may be the more appropriate way to address that flexibility. So I'm going to close here and we'll get into the Q&A. What's not included in this code package? Sandra mentioned it's been a small team. We've spent several years working this, and I think we feel really good about turning over many stones through the community involvement process and learning from the testimony we received from a variety of perspectives. But we scoped the project as a zoning code amendment project, not a project to designate new districts or to create new landmarks. Thinking about future work. So we aren't proposing any new designations. We're not proposing to reevaluate in the code amendments any existing designations. So Irvington would stay a historic district. The Lads Edition would stay a historic district under these code amendments. So we're not making those evaluative decisions by any districts here. We are opening that door, which today isn't open, to have that evaluative discussion. We're not changing the height map or the zoning, the base zones and districts. We've done that in recent projects, including Central City 2035, Better Housing by Design, residential infill projects. So we're not amending specific properties or zoning for specific properties. And we're not revising any district-specific design guidelines. I will be back before you sometime middle or end of next year with an update to one of our most outdated set of district design guidelines, applying the Little South Portland Historic District. We're not doing that today. But you will hear a lot on November 3rd about future work. And it's something that we're excited about at the Bureau. There's an unlimited list of great historic preservation work that could happen in the city. Mayor Wheeler mentioned NEON. Our counterparts in the city of San Francisco have a great NEON grant program that prioritizes small businesses for restoring their neon signs. Other cities like San Antonio have legacy business programs that provide direct support and funding to BIPOC-owned legacy businesses. there are great preservation ideas out there in the community that go beyond the code. I'm sure council will hear about some of those ideas on November 3rd as, let's say, a first pitch at future work. We're not in these code amendments bringing forward any future work, but certainly council will be hearing from members of the community about future work and what happens after these code amendments in our world of historic resources. Mayor.
Yeah, and I'd certainly welcome any of these ideas coming through the commissioner in charge to council. You know, we spent a considerable amount of time last year debating whether or not a particular sign was historical or not. Personally, I thought it was, not all that, but I understand it's subjective at some level. But the idea of potentially grants to incentivize businesses to keep them, that this was a case where the business owner did not want to keep the sign, and there were some in the community who did want the business owner to keep the sign. And I can see how a grant program could potentially sway a business owner to say, okay, well, if it's not really going to cost me all that much to do it, why not? So those kinds of ideas are innovative. And so if you guys want to have conversations with Commissioner Rubio and Commissioner Rubio deems the ideas worthy, I'm sure the rest of the council would certainly be interested in hearing about them.
Commissioner Matz.
Yeah, if we're pitching our historic preservation projects, I want to share a concern. This isn't exactly what we're talking about today, but I do think that we are at a tipping point in terms of the historic preservation of Black churches here in Portland. We have a legacy of historic Blacks. I think one of the places where Black history in Portland lives is in our Black churches. One of the other dynamics that we see is that over time, people have moved out of these neighborhoods, a lot of them in Northeast and North. But many folks continue to, come in from Vancouver and whatnot and frequent those churches on the weekends. And congregations are also aging, and attendance at many of these churches is down compared to the historic levels. I suspect COVID has also changed the dynamics of the use of those Black churches. So I suspect in the next 10 years, we might see a wave of, or a crisis point, or at least a tipping point in the fate of these buildings. And I think it would just be an awful shame if we lost some of these spaces. And I know that's a concern for some folks. I don't really see, frankly, a mechanism in place right now to address that. But I fear that 10 years from now, the Black churches that I get to go out and visit on some Sundays will just not exist. And I think that will be a loss for our city.
Commissioner Matz, just one thought on that. I had the privilege of being invited by Raymond Burrell to assist with the nomination of the Vancouver Avenue First Baptist Church to the National Register about 4 years ago. And Raymond was a great historian, an advocate for Black churches in the North and Northeast. And Raymond passed way too early a few years ago. And when he was on hospice, asked me and asked the Bureau to continue our work that he left behind to work on African-American historic churches, and made a promise to him on his literal deathbed that we would get the Mount Olivet Baptist Church listed in the National Register. And we have that nomination now heading to the National Park Service, using Raymond's great work to get that church designated. And it's important, I think you're right on, for us to get the regulations are important, but so too are the incentives. And when we've thought about these use incentives, we've been thinking about not just Black churches, but churches citywide, and allowing for a little more commercial activity as an income generating opportunity in churches. Maybe it's yoga classes on Tuesdays, maybe it is as a rehearsal space, maybe it's as a small coffee shop like the Tabor space. If we can use adaptive reuse as a way to keep those institutions in their buildings with money coming in the door through historic preservation, but we want to remove barriers to that happening. It's certainly not the only answer, but it's definitely been our mind with the reuse incentives.
I'm glad to hear that, Brandon, and thank you for your work in preserving some of these spaces. And certainly my office would be interested in engaging in discussions about how we can help keep some of these spaces alive for future generations.
Commissioner Rubio.
Thank you, Brandon and Sandra. And as always, excellent presentation, very detailed and informative, and you've given us a lot to think about. My question is maybe is connected Commissioner Mapp's question a little more broadly about one question that is coming up for me is to what extent have you worked with BIPOC communities and neighborhoods or areas in the city, organizations, to ensure that this approach is not unintentionally creating more barriers to identifying more historic resources and elevating them to that first layer status or beyond. So I'm just curious if you can just say a little bit of that. And then part two of my question would be actually a different question. Just what are the next steps then after this? What does it mean for us moving forward?
Yeah, good question. A couple of answers. One, during the concept development early phases, we wanted to make sure that we were hearing from those people who owned and rented properties that are already designated. So what are the rules that apply to those things that are already designated? We have sent multiple mailed notices to property owners in North and Northeast Portland to make sure that where those landmarks and districts are designated, that we get the opportunity for existing members of the Black community who've been there a long time to give us their feedback. As part of that, we did talk to about 500 property owners who received those notices about regulation and about the proposed approach. And I think generally what we heard was a lot of support for that demolition review so that community members could have a conversation about the removal of a significant building, that there was a venue for that discussion, but also a lot of support for limiting those design regulations for minor exterior alterations, making it easier to make everyday routine repairs to buildings without a review, to ensure that for those things that are already designated, there is a degree of flexibility, that we don't review interior changes. And so a general theme of what I heard at least was that the review of demolition at a public hearing, not necessarily in front of council, but a review of demolition is important, but that we maybe have an opportunity to reduce barriers to minor exterior alterations. And that's what we've tried to do with the code amendments. What we also know, and we saw the map, we don't have an equitably distributed list of landmarks and districts citywide. So there are many communities who have been underrepresented or entirely excluded from our landmark and district list. And when we've engaged in those conversations, most of our discussion has been around future work. When these code amendments are in effect, how can we support those communities in documenting their historic places and facilitating and empowering those communities to bring forward landmark designations. Because today, many of these regulations won't apply to specific communities' most significant structures. For example, we, up until 8 months ago, had no LGBTQ historic resources on our landmark list, and got to work with Don Horn, who will testify on November 3rd, with the Darcel House and Showplace. Such a fun exercise. And we received a National Park Service grant that will come before you for grant acceptance in a few weeks, to continue that work with the LGBTQ community. And that's what I think we want to see more of with Latinx community, with our recent immigrant communities, with others who today, these code amendments, the regulations don't affect those communities since they don't have a landmark. They don't have a district that's important.
It begs the question, Brennan. And first, let me just say, I could listen to you all day. I really could.
Mutual admiration.
Hey, you are a fascinating presenter, and I know that you feel this work in your bones. So it is it's always wonderful to have somebody who actually lives and breathes the work that they do, right? Because then it's not really work. But my question has to do with, as we are talking about new designations, the reality is that no matter how many places we identify in Northeast Portland as historic to the Black community, the Black community, quote unquote, has been shifted to other parts of the city. And so it kind of feels like we are trying to build something after it's already been destroyed, basically. And so because of that, is there any visionary thinking about, like I think of the Jade District is that appropriate for a historic designation? It may not have 100 years history, but it has been built up based on the hard work of Asian Pacific Islanders who live in that community. I think about the Urban League building, and which is not a fancy building, but it is historic to a community who has spent so much time in that building. I think, is it possible to actually build something new and then designate that as historic because of who built it? I think of ANEA and the building that they are doing around affordable housing for Native families. So I guess all those questions have been in my head ever since you've been talking. You can pick a couple of them and continue to talk later. But I guess for me, what is the biggest question is, what is the most proactive thing we can do so that we are intentional about making sure that we are creating historic representation that reflects the diversity of the community we serve?
I think that's a great question, Commissioner. I'll answer it 2 parts. One, what we know, we see it on the ground, is those places that are important to communities that haven't been the beneficiary of preservation have been and are being erased. And so part of the interest from those volunteers and historians we've worked with on the African American Historic Sites Project has been, there's an issue of displacement. There is certainly economic forces and real forces affecting people's lives today. But if we lose some of these buildings, we will continue to lose the evidence of the outstanding contributions and the role of the community. And so part of it is about, let's say, memorializing the building or the place so that it doesn't get erased and that story can't be forgotten. But I think your point is spot on with the use and sort of continued livelihood. We had the opportunity to bring forward to council a last-minute zone change that allowed for the preservation of a historic house on Northeast Sacramento for a longstanding African-American family who've been the victims of some of our racist history of building and land use. And we were able to use adaptive reuse as a way to empower that family to save a building, historic building, but also have an economically viable way to use it. And I think that there's more and more justification for buildings are important, but how do we make sure that they're usable, that the people who own them or tenants have economic opportunity and not just regulation. But I think some of this is an important conversation outside of the zoning code. How do we use incentives? Specifically, as a great conversation, Commissioner, we talked about recently, that the Representative Valderrama in the legislature is reviewing some of those state financial incentives to evaluate whether they can work better as an anti-displacement and historic preservation tool, not just a building rehab tool, but how do we keep people in their houses, or importantly, bring people back or give people access to get back. So I think there's so much great work that can happen on this. And I think that we're excited to be hearing from the public on November 3rd and moving out of code amendments into the world of what do we do to keep cultural meaning permanent. I'm going to finish here. We've got a little more time before the end, but I think we promised we'd end early. November 3rd will be the council hearing. We've got 3 hours. You're going to hear from a lot of people, different relationships with this topic, different perspectives on it. We'll ask that if we get through testimony that day, that the record closes. Around November 12th, we would like to have made the rounds at your offices to collect any and all amendment requests. The hope is we can publish those amendments right before the first winter holiday, the Thanksgiving holiday, so that the public has access to what those amendments may be. We'll hold an amendments hearing sometime in December, provided that there are amendments from council offices. And then we will look to a January vote on the code package in hopes of a March 1st effective date. Mayor?
Yeah, Brandon, and I'm a huge fan of ending early. So first of all, let me just say, so I don't forget, I really appreciate this presentation. You took a very meaty and complex subject and you and your colleagues boiled it down. Expect when we're hearing from the public. You mentioned that we'll have lots of testimony. Could you give us just sort of the elevator version of where do you think the fault lines are going to lie as you and your staff prepare for that presentation and the public input? What do you see as being sort of the competing interests that we're likely to hear and that we will need to balance as we make our decisions?
Great question, and I'll try to give a summary.
Thank you.
Written testimony will be available in the MAP app. So we'd encourage all of you to look at the MAP app. Testimony is coming in. I think we have something like 50 pieces of testimony that's now been submitted. Testimony in the MAP app. In general, one of the benefits of a small program and a long timeline for bringing code amendments forward is we've had the benefit of sitting down with a lot of people, workshopping their concerns, talking through their issues. And so what I think council will hear, even if it's in the background, is broad support for the general framework we're bringing forward, broad support for many of the technical amendments, broad support for many of the process improvements. There will certainly be a group of people who have preferred the National Register District approach of automatic historic district protections, no city council, no land use weighing of benefits and burdens to receive historic district status. And similarly, concerned that these code amendments would allow for future reconsideration of past district designations and protection. So there will be concern about, I would primarily characterize it as large residential areas that are currently or pursuing that National Register district status for the purpose of protection. I think there'll also be concern about, how do I want to say this, concern about how specifically affordable housing new construction is reviewed in historic districts. We allow new buildings in historic districts. We've seen many examples of market rate and affordable housing developments regularly that are approved, and Hillary can talk more about that. And so we've had a really healthy conversation with affordable housing developers and the housing advocacy community. I think there's a variety of different ideas on the table. We're still having that conversation, but I think there may be some conversations around what more might we do to help streamline the review of new affordable housing developments.
Thank you. That's super helpful. And then knowing that, what would be helpful for me during that hearing is to have, if staff has a specific recommendation to us as council, illustrative examples, case studies, those kinds of things would be really helpful. Like I see you have Revolution Hall up here on a slide. I see that as a success. I assume other people see that as a success as well. Just illustrate some of your points with real case studies that we understand, that community members can understand. And I think that helps maybe break through some of the complexity of the subject that we're talking about today.
Good feedback. And I should also say some of the testimony that you'll receive, because this is a land use project within a state context and a federal context, there are sideboards. So we don't have, unlike some other decision-making, we do bump up against these regulatory sideboards, including our city comprehensive plan, past council decision-making. And so that'll be an interesting part of the discussion too, is unlike the design overlays on amendments where we have had quite a bit of authority, there are some unique wrinkles in this.
I'm sure there are. I'm sure we're going to hear from affordable housing providers as well. And I certainly look forward to hearing their perspective. All right, colleagues, anything else then before? All right, Brandon, it looks like we're giving you like 11 minutes of your life back. Thank you. Great presentation, everybody. Commissioner Rubio, thank you. This is outstanding work. And I'm sure we'll all have much more opportunity to discuss this at greater length. We are adjourned.
Thank you.
Recording stopped.